Mentorship can be a vital experience for Latinx mental health clinicians, yet many might not be taking advantage of this enriching experience. Often, when we think about mentorship, it is hierarchical and viewed in which the mentee is getting something in return. But is that necessarily true? How might mentorship, direct and indirect, facilitate professional growth, especially amongst Latinx therapists? Also, how might we approach mentorship as a natural part of our personal and professional identity? Are there strategies to engage and talk about mentorship? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Zhen. We have Dr. Mejia as our guest today. She is a board-certified telemental health provider and a virtual care medical director for a behavioral health collaborative care program. Dr. Mejia has extensive experience leading integrated care teams and training programs at large healthcare systems. She has a breadth of clinical experience ranging from providing CBT chronic pain treatment to military, veteran, and Hispanic clients, CBT insomnia treatment, CBT treatments for chronic health conditions, and even bilingual mental health treatment to Caribbean-identified Hispanic high school students. As a Latina of Puerto Rican descent, Dr. Mejia will be having a conversation with us about the importance of mentorship for emerging Latinx leaders. Dr. Mejia, thank you for speaking with me today.
Hi, Jack. I'm thrilled to be here.
Tell me a little bit about your journey. How did you get here? Because one of the things that we've been hearing on the podcast is just the lack of representation of Latinx faculty members, Latinx psychologists. So I'm really curious about your journey and how did you get to where you are at today?
Yes, my journey, I think, started very early on. I grew up in the South Bronx, and I recall just being a young kid and always asking the question to myself, why? Why is this neighborhood so stressful? Why is there a lot of violence among this community? Why is there a substance abuse issue? I remember growing up and it was at the peak of the crack epidemic and walking in my neighborhood and seeing crack vials on the floor. And it became a game as to how many red tops could I count, how many blue tops could I count, and so forth. And so I think my early childhood and adolescence was incredibly stressful, but also fascinating at the same time. I was just curious as to what drove these particular behaviors. And fast forward, my mom, she went to community college, and I remember she had her introduction to psychology course, which she wasn't really looking forward to. But I remember seeing this, like the biggest textbook I have ever come across in my young life. And I turned just randomly to a page, and the chapter was on consciousness. And I started reading about sleep stages and dreams, and I was just enthralled by it. And then I pretty much read that whole textbook, and I think my mom kind of enjoyed that I was fascinated because I recall like summarizing the learnings, to her. And I think in high school, when I started thinking about the next stage, the next phase in my life, I always went back to those earlier questions that I posed about the why behind behaviors and my learnings from this textbook. And I didn't have any alternative ideas. I didn't really know much about business or finance or law. I wasn't necessarily super interested in the other things. And I just said, all right, well, let's try this psychology thing and let's see where this takes me. And so, yeah, that's it in a nutshell. That's how my
Wow.
journey started.
Wow. At such an early age, I'm actually wondering about this. Was there a sense that this shouldn't be happening or something's off?
Well, most definitely, just observing a lot of unhappiness, a lot of mistreatment of fellow community members. At the same time, it just seemed very tight knit. It was just very contradictory. So, yes, there was a lot of emphasis on community, but then there was so much strife. And it was that strife that just seemed very, very off to me. How can we be close and yet hurt each other?
Now, you got really interested in psychology and then started reading about, the consciousness of the mind. And as you were going along your graduate training program, you have also mentioned you did encounter mentors that are Latinx.
Actually, I did not encounter mentors that were Latinx.
Oh,
No,
you did not?
I did not.
Oh,
No.
okay. So what kept you going?
What kept me going was just my thirst for knowledge. I love psychology. I mean, I could continue learning till my very last day. And I think that's what really kept me driven. But on some level, being aware that I did not always have representation that really reflected me being a Latina. And this was across the board in undergraduate all the way into the graduate program. So yeah, I it was not something that I always thought about because part of it is that I grew up in New York City and I did all of my, college and graduate work in New York City. I started my career there. And so it seemed it wasn't top of mind because a lot of my colleagues ultimately and some classmates were Hispanic or Black. And so I felt okay as far as being represented, having a sense of diversity, although I didn't really think about, well, who are my teachers? Who are my leaders? Who are my mentors? And I think that process really started when I left New York City, when I started encountering various experiences that really forced me to take pause and think about, oh, okay, I always knew about prejudice and racism and discrimination, but it's something quite different when you experience it yourself. So I'll pause here to see if there's any follow-up questions because I could easily go down, a rabbit trail here.
So the experiences that you had, was that in graduate programs or outside of graduate programs in relationship to the racist experiences that made you think?
Yeah, it was outside. It was already, I was already a psychologist. So I started my career in New York City. That's where I worked in, public hospital, ended up working in a high school. And so working with a lot of diversity, my clients were from all over. And I really took that for granted. And it wasn't until I moved to Texas and presently I'm in Oregon when I started experiencing very difficult moments that, like I said, it just really made me pause, not just on what's happening to me, ultimately, how do I take care of myself, and really focusing on, okay, what are other people, other Hispanic and BIPOC clinicians facing that we don't always openly talk about. I do think that a lot of us, especially when our leaders are not representative, right, of our
Mhm, mhm.
identity, a lot of these things we really, really internalize, and it has an impact on us.
In addition to that internalization process, we also don't talk about it openly.
Right.
Yeah,
Correct.
yeah. Mm. I remember our work at the VA. This is one of the amazing things of having you as a speaker for this podcast and speaking about mentorship. And I'm just going to say this, probably embarrass you online. I remember when we were going through the process of changing leadership in primary care behavioral health. And I think it was just me, you, and another staff. That was it to run the entire
Yeah.
Austin clinic. And we were left with the decision of how do y'all want to run this? Because previously the leadership structure was done this way. And we just looked at each other and we all said, why don't we just take turns?
Yeah.
It was so intuitive. And of course, there was that, I don't know, that syncrasy that was going on between all of us. And we just think,
Mhm.
doesn't make sense for someone to keep holding this position of power.
Right, right.
And I think instantaneously, I just, oh, I really admire Dr. Mejia for this type of, I don't know, this approach, this value. It was just amazing.
Yeah, oh my goodness. Yes, I remember that very, very clearly. And it was just so casual. And ultimately, we said, let's just start with our last name. Like, who's up?
Yes, yes. It just is like it didn't make sense to hold on to powers.
Right,
Yeah,
right. Let's
yeah,
share the love here.
yes, yes. So sorry for embarrassing you in front of our
No,
listeners.
but thank you for reminding me. I have not thought of that memory in quite some time. And as you can see, right, it just brings a big smile to my face. Yeah.
Yes, yes, yeah. So in thinking about our listeners, especially those who are early career Latinx therapists or possibly mid-career, what would you say to them? And specifically in terms of mentorship, what would you recommend for someone? I'll ask you another question later on, but for now, for the Latinx therapists in their early or mid-career, what would you say to them?
Yeah, I would say seek your mentor, whether it's someone that's already on staff. If you don't find someone that is really a reflection of you and some of your experiences, you might have to seek externally. And it can be a time consuming process, but I think it's definitely an important investment to make, for yourself, not just professionally, but personally as well. And so really perhaps seeking on LinkedIn, right? Just establishing a professional network and taking the risk and just sending someone a message. In fact, that actually happened. It was a while ago, but I remember some random person just sent me a message on LinkedIn, and my first thought was, "Wow, that was courageous. I don't know if I would have ever done that." And it was just a back and forth conversation, maybe like 4 messages that we sent to each other. And I was just very struck by this person's courage. And I wish I had that courage early on in my career. So, all that to say is for early career, even mid career, Hispanic professionals, is just reach out, ask, hey, do you have a moment I like to pick your brain on XYZ. And when I really speak of mentorship, it's not about establishing a long-term weekly relationship with someone. It's really having a mentorship moment, and that's where I'm really prioritizing that. And at this point in my career, really just opening the door for anyone that has a question or just needs reassurance. And that is a mentoring moment, an opportunity that can really go a long way for anyone that is doubting themselves or thinking that, oh, others may not understand where I'm coming from because I am Latina, or I have this particular experience that my leaders don't have and can't really empathize or understand where I'm coming from and why I'm raising these ideas and so forth.
Wow, that is very powerful because when I think about mentorship and I'm thinking about how others think about mentorship, it comes across more of a formalized process.
Right.
And you're talking about just this moment of experience.
Yeah. 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 I always think about, how do we define leadership? And from my perspective, everyone is a leader in a very specific way, regardless of our role. So, very similarly, right? We all have the capacity to mentor someone. We also have the opportunity and the capacity to be a mentee ourselves, right? We always have the opportunity to grow and learn. And it's really twofold. How do you offer some of your experience and wisdom to others, but also how do you receive in turn?
This gives me a view of how you're thinking about relationships, this very interconnected view.
Hmm.
Do you have any thoughts to how your cultural experience may have shaped that view?
That stems from what I was saying earlier about growing up in this very tight knit but conflictual community. It's hard to explain. I think this is just something that's just ingrained, that has always been ingrained in my being. It's not something that I've obviously actively thought about. It's just my way. I do understand why certain relationships are hierarchical in nature, but I do think that we benefit the most when we can acknowledge that both parties have a lot to offer each other. I have a lot of gratitude for all the supervisees and colleagues that have viewed me as a mentor, but I also make it a point to express gratitude in how much I have learned from them, because it's 100% true. All the conversations that I've had, I've always felt that I have one kernel of knowledge, right, following this conversation than before it started. And I'm just very thoughtful about that. And I think this is also really reminding me how it's just so important to be responsive when people do reach out. Even if it's been, for example, I got a message the other day. Hi, Dr. Mejia. I hope you remember me. So this is someone that I haven't spoken to maybe like 4 years or so, right? And of course I remember her. But just taking that moment, even though I'm very, very busy, but just reminding myself that this is not just me answering her question, but it's how I can also gain from her knowledge and her expertise, right? Because she's still early career, but she's definitely gained knowledge and information that I may not necessarily have myself. So.
Thanks for sharing that insight. I really like that you're thinking about this mentorship as a growth model for everyone.
Yes.
Everyone's learning, everyone's growing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the other thing that we talk about too is, in addition to lack of representation, how do we support therapists who are different when it comes to our racial ethnic background? So for in the case here, what would you recommend someone who is not Latinx? How might they be able to effectively support another Latinx therapist?
It's really asking questions. For example, something as simple as, am I on the right track when I say XYZ? Or how is this resonating with you? I mean, it's not really that complicated. Really going in humble, not with these assumptions, right? That one knows, right? Because we're all mental health professionals and I have an idea what your experience has been. I mean, I think that's a big mistake on many individuals' parts. It's just being very open and asking these very simple questions to me is not necessarily all that complicated. And also taking some time to read a little bit, right? So if you know that your mentee or your supervisee is of a particular, race, culture, and you have to acknowledge, right, that you don't know. So that shouldn't be an excuse, then get to know, not necessarily by asking the mentee, teach me, but it's really your duty, your ethical duty to research and learn. I
Mhm,
mean, there's many articles, there's many books, there's Google, and I mean, information is just so readily accessible.
mhm, mhm. Thanks for that tip. And I hope that people who are in supervisory positions can think about this and actively have conversations about race, culture, ethnicity, and how that can impact treatment. In thinking about your career as a person of color, what were some challenges that you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are several, but I'll share this one. So when I left New York City, I moved to Texas, and my first job was at a military base and pretty rural Texas. So it's definitely a culture shock in so many ways. And so my name in Spanish, my maiden name is Colon, which is a pretty popular Latino last name. And in New York City, I mean, no one would bat an eye, right? It's like Mirna Colon, 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 Colon. But then in Texas, it became a thing. So the second O has an accent, but of course in EHRs, there's no accent on names. And so people were just very confused with how I pronounce my last name, right? So I would say Colon, and then I started getting questions, but wait, it's spelled colon. And then also in English, right, I would just say, oh, I'm Myrna Cologne. And then I would get the question, but that's spelled incorrectly. Like cologne, like perfume cologne. No, your name is spelled colon. And so this became a thing really on a regular basis. And I recall, and I might get a little emotional here, right? I recall being in this very large staff meeting, and the leader, right, of this meeting, the really the chief of the whole mental health program, started making fun of my last name. Very, very inappropriate. And I had colleagues that were pretty outraged. And he pretty much said, well, I'm going to say colon because that's how it's spelled. And so that was pretty upsetting. And then, and that was on the staff side, but on the patient side, on the client side, I also found having these conversations in sessions. No, my name is Cologne or Cologne, and that's it. And then some patients would say, oh my goodness, I'm so relieved that this is a mental health appointment. I thought I was coming in for a colonoscopy. Ha ha ha, you must get that all the time. Well, no. And I would say that, no, I don't get that all the time. And so this became a thing. And so I really wrestled with, okay, I've been here already, and this was from one setting, and then I moved to another setting in Texas, and it was still a thing. And so I had to really make a decision. Do I want to continue having these conversations that have nothing to do with psychology and how I can help others? Or do I change my name, my current name, Mejia, my husband's name? And and that's what I decided to do. I changed my last name because I was pretty sick and tired of having these conversations on a regular basis. Now, Mejia also, often came up in conversations. Oh, is it Mejia? Is it Mejia? And over time, I get less and less of that. But it's just really disappointing how something like my last name, my identity became this almost like battleground every single day. Like I felt like I was just standing on my own, fighting for my identity. And in the end, having to choose, okay, what's ultimately going to be easier for me? So yeah, so that's one of my experiences that was very, very difficult, being a person, being a Latina and having to justify and educate people on the correct pronunciation of a pretty common last name.
Gosh, I'm so sorry you went through that experience because I can tell how difficult that was based on the expression on your face. I felt it too because I'm thinking about, as you were saying, it's almost as though I'm sacrificing a part of my identity.
Hmm.
And to openly ridicule that name, also a person of power doing that,
Yes.
is clearly inappropriate.
Yeah.
And I think this is something that a lot of people of color with last names that are different, my last name, Sun,
Hmm.
having to reiterate and talk about this. So there's an experience that we recognize. We have
Right.
to justify,
Hmm.
explain. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that, Dr. Mejia.
Sure.
I want to shift gears and to think about the clinical work that you've done,
Hmm.
which is quite amazing, actually. When I
Hmm.
learned that you actually delivered mental health treatment in a different language entirely.
Right. Yes.
Tell me about that experience. What was that like?
Yeah. Oh, I absolutely loved it. So this was all in New York. So very early career. My first job was in Bronx, Lebanon Hospital, right? So a public hospital. And I ended up working in an outpatient clinic, primarily with the senior population. And I would say it was like 95% all monolingual, right? Spanish speaking. So I would do one-on-one sessions, and I had a lot of groups back then. And that was just so much fun. And this community of patients really supported me, encouraged me, right? Sometimes I always didn't I didn't know how to express like all words right in Spanish. And so it was just very friendly teasing, right? They would say, oh, Doctora Colon, she speaks Spanglish, right? Because I mean, it was, like 80% Spanish, 20%, English. It was just an immersive experience. I felt that my Spanish skills only strengthened, right, with my work with clients. And then after I moved on from that position, I ultimately ended up working in a high school based clinic in Washington Heights. And the majority of the sessions were in Spanish as well, right? But this was with the adolescent population. So the bulk of this population were immigrants from the Dominican Republic, some from Mexico. And so communicating with them and their families, it was just a very enriching experience. And if whoever knows the Spanish language well, it's a very passionate
Mm. Mhm.
lively um, language that I love. And then I left New York City thinking that I was going to Texas and I was going to continue to use my Spanish skills. And oh, I was completely mistaken. I rarely spoke Spanish in in Texas, and then in Oregon, even less so.
Mm.
Yeah, so it's been an interesting journey in that respect.
How do you navigate the adaptation versus constructs? Did you notice that you were taking more of a westernized type of therapy, like just put CBT, for example, and having to push that onto a clinical population that didn't quite fit? Were there adaptations you had to consider?
Definitely adaptations, regardless of the modality that one is using. So I was initially trained in both psychodynamic work and CBT work. And I mean, there's a lot of tools and theories and principles that, of course, can be applied in working with the Latino population, but there are some that just don't always resonate. And also thinking about spirituality, right? Religion, how that is important, how their belief systems is certainly relevant in their emotional healing journey, and just being cognizant of all of that. And so, yeah, I would just start with, okay, this is my framework here. Let's see how it lands with the particular patient. And if it doesn't, this is not about the patient being resistant. It's basically I have to find what is going to resonate more with the patient. What do I need to adjust and tailor to really meet their specific needs? This also brings up another memory of supervisee that I had that was non-Hispanic, was working with a Latina, and the supervisee was 100% like CBT oriented, right, clinician. And I understand, following the manualized treatment, but at some point it became just a little too rigid. And in my conversation with this supervisee, they said, well, perhaps the patient is not that sophisticated. Which I definitely had like this physical like response, and I'm like, can you clarify what you just said? And basically it was just not an understanding that this client that grew up in a similar environment that I did, patient grew up in Chicago, not in the South Bronx, also Puerto Rican. And I had to like explain a little bit of what it was probably like for this patient that this supervisee just had no experience whatsoever, right? But instead of being curious about the patient's experience, the conclusion was, oh, this patient is just not sophisticated to do the work of CBT. That was a teachable moment, hopefully for the supervisee, but also for me as well, right? And really gauging where my students, right, my interns, prac students, what's their lens as they're working with, diverse populations.
You're not faulting the trainee, you're also thinking about how do they develop this lens
Right,
that they're conveying this message.
right, right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Dr. Mejia, is there anything else you'd like to add for today's podcast?
Well, going back to the original point, right, is the importance of mentorship relationships, right? Mentorship moments, just for early career practitioners to, despite the vulnerability, despite the anxiety that might be felt in reaching out to, a Latinx leader, just taking the risk. Like, what do you have to lose, right? What do you have to lose? And think more also, what do you stand to gain by just saying, hello, I have a question, would you be willing to share a few moments? I think that can really go a long way with a lot of BIPOC clinicians in general, not just the Latinx, community of clinicians, but at times it can be a very, very lonely process.
Mm.
And you're really not alone. There's a lot of us out here. I mean, we're still underrepresented in this field, but there's plenty of us, right? And I would hope that the majority of us or all of us would be inclined to just take 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and just be present with someone that is seeking guidance.
I really appreciate the reframe, really focusing on a moment experience as opposed to this long contractual agreement that I must
Yes,
commit to meet once a week thing.
right,
Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
right.
Well, and how might listeners find you?
I am on LinkedIn. So yeah, it's easy to find me. Just type in my name, Myrna Mejia, and then also my email is pretty easy to remember. So Myrna Mejia, PhD at gmail.com. So send me a message either via Gmail or on LinkedIn. I'm happy to share a moment.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mejia, for being on the show.
Yes, happy to be here. And I'm happy for the work that you are doing. It's so important.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.
A huge thank you to our listeners. If you like what you've heard, please share and subscribe to our podcast, People of Color in Psychology.